Hi, folks. Welcome to another episode of My Life with Robert Burns. Douglas Mackenzie here again to talk to another of our cronies from around the Burns world. Tonight's guest is a former guide and volunteer at Robert Burns Birthplace Museum. She's formerly the secretary of the Irvine Lassies Burns Club and has done a couple of highlight talks at the museum as well. So quite a talented lady. So cronies everywhere, please welcome Jean Swinley. Hi, Jean, how you doing?
Hello there, I'm fine, thanks. Nice to see you, Douglas.
Looks like a nice night where you're sitting, Jean.
It's not bad at all, quite a nice afternoon. I'm just wondering if I'll get away without watering my plants tonight. We'll need to go out and have a wee look at them.
Well, I'm in a different location tonight. I'm in Greenock, and it's a wee bit of rain this morning, so the plants that are sitting out there on the balcony are looking quite healthy. So I apologise to our audience, and there were a few techie issues tonight. Jim hasn't managed to join us, and I'm probably going to be showing you some camera angles as I'm moving about here, which are different to what you'd normally expect. But let's just get on with it. So, Jean, we always start with the same question. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yes, I currently live in Ayr. I'm married with three children and a little grandson now. I was born and brought up in Ayrshire, although I haven't always lived in Ayrshire. I spent my early years in Moncton, where my dad was one of the two village policemen. And then we moved into Prestwick, where I went to Prestwick Public School, which I think is a community centre now, and then Kincase Primary, Prestwick Academy, and then I went to Edinburgh University, where I studied law. I wanted to do that since I was about 9 or 10. Made up my mind very quickly what I wanted to do, and I wanted to be the person in court with a wig and a gown on. Although I refined it slightly from there once I found out what it was all about. Did training and qualified in Edinburgh and stayed there for quite a long time. Had my first two children there, my sons, and then we had a spell in France with my husband's work before returning to Ayrshire, where we've been ever since. And since then, we've added my daughter to the family, who's nearly 30, which I can hardly believe. I must have been a child bride.
So that was a whistle-stop tour of your life so far. Let's go back to primary school. So which primary school did you say you've been to?
It was Prestwick Public School in
Oh,
Carlaverock Road. So
wow.
it's still there, a lovely sandstone building, which I now drive past regularly, and remember it as being much bigger than it actually is. I think probably that's a fairly common thing with people in their schools. And I then went to Kincase Primary. I was one of the first pupils in the school every year. We were one of the first ones, so some teething troubles there. And then off to Prestwick Academy, and I did 6 years there before going off to university. I enjoyed my school. I was quite bookish, perhaps a little sporty, very keen reader, but generally I quite enjoyed it. Played badminton at school, not very good at any other sort of physical stuff, but quite musical. Did
What did you
exams
play?
and things. I played the piano, the recorder, and the classical guitar. Classical guitar is
Oh,
my first love, and I would love to have done something with that as my living. But I was competent, but I wasn't special, and it's not an orchestral instrument, so there weren't too many opportunities. So my second love was debating and English, and the law seemed to be quite a good way to combine those two.
uh-huh.
Actually, my children would say, "What you mean is you love to talk, Mum," but I prefer to say English and debating.
Uh, so at primary school, did you come across Burns at all?
Yes, I did. Kind of very. When I look back, I don't remember too much. We would get the usual. It was more like most songs I remember singing. But I was aware of Burns when I went to school. But that was actually through my late dad, who was a great Burns enthusiast. And in my childhood bedroom, I can remember this quite distinctly. And I'm talking about when I was about 4 or 5. I had a poster on my wall. Um, the railway posters that they would bring out for special events when people travelled everywhere by train, and you had the big station hotels. There was one
Uh-huh.
published in 1959 for the bicentenary of Burns' birth. encouraging people to go to the land of Burns. And there's a figure of Burns in the middle of it, and it's surrounded by little scenes of people and places from his poetry. Highland Mary's there, Jean Armour, Clorinda, the Cotters there, trudging back to the cot at night. The Twa dogs are there, photographs of some of the wee farms. And each night when my parents took me up to bed, either my mum or my dad, they would say my prayers, now I lay me down to sleep, etc. And if it was my dad that was doing it, which was not as often as my mum because dad worked shifts, but dad would sit on the end of the bed and we would talk about the people in the poster. So I listened to stories about Burns' life. I listened to the stories about the Cotter. I listened to stories about Highland Mary and the dogs, Caesar and Lewis. And at some point, I can't remember exactly when, but at some point in my very young brain, something clicked and I understood that this was a real person and that most of the things in the poster were real. And of course, living in Ayrshire, it was quite easy to be taken and see them. I mean, I think I must drive past Burns cottage most days of my life. And you just take it so much for granted. And yet, as a guide there, I have had on more than one occasion visitors from far away who have longed to go to Burns Cottage, who cry because they can't believe they're there. And there they find me sometimes sitting on a hay bale with my flask of tea in a damp afternoon in November, waiting for visitors. So it's quite a special place, and I think you forget that. So I was aware of all that when I went to school, but it wasn't really until into secondary school that I kind of picked it up again.
And in secondary school, what was your subjects? What was your favourite subjects?
English was my favourite subject. I did English, I did maths because I had to do maths to get into university. I didn't like maths, I wasn't very good at it. And I did French and German and music. They were my hires. And Latin, did I say Latin? They were. I think I did 5 in 5th year and did another couple in 6th year. I can't remember, but not sciencey at all. So I didn't do any of the scientific ones. I did the languages and things like that. Much more comfortable with that than anything else.
Yeah, yeah. So you were going on to say that you came across Burns again during your secondary education.
Well, in my secondary, I think my dad could see that I was a keen reader, and there was lots and lots of Burns books and things in the house. Not just Burns. My dad was a great lover of Wordsworth and Robert Service and Thomas Carlyle. So there was lots of stuff around in the house. And my dad, quite carefully, I think, just introduced me to things gradually as he thought I would cope with them and they would hold my interest. And when I was about 18 or 19, he got me reading the James Barke books, Immortal Memory, which I read. But when I was in 6th year, I did 6 year studies English, and I did my wee dissertation that you have to do as part of it on, I can still remember the title, I can still see it. My mum typed it for me, and it was called Man and Nature in the Poetry of Robert Burns. And it was quite a challenging dissertation to do. I say dissertation, it was a school, a big school essay, if you like, but my English teacher, with whom I got on very well, did not like Burns at all. So I think he found it as difficult to help me with that as I did to be helped by him. But the time I'd left school and gone to university, I was really a wee bit hooked and wanting to find out more. And I think by that time also I had found out a wee bit more about Burns' life, and I did then and still do find his story and him absolutely fascinating. And the more I find out, the more fascinating I find it is. I think it's what Burns did when he did it and from where he did it. He shouldn't have been able to achieve lots of the things that he achieved, and on a global stage especially. So I think it's just fascinating. It's a marvellous story. And then when you realise the man at the centre of it all was actually a real person, it's even more so.
Yeah, fantastic. So after school, university to study law, was that in Glasgow?
That was in Edinburgh.
Edinburgh?
Yeah.
You mentioned Edinburgh earlier on.
Yeah, no, my family are all in Edinburgh. I actually spent a lot of time in Edinburgh, particularly now because I help out one day a week with looking after my wee grandson who's there, just waiting for the school's competitions to come round. Maybe Granny Jean will become quite useful then, I hope. I enjoyed university. I found it quite heavy going. I found the subject quite difficult. I had to work really hard to get through it, but I did. But the bits I enjoyed most were the debating bits, the mock trials and things that we did. I really enjoyed that because a lot of that is I think is as much to do with being comfortable speaking as knowing the nuts and bolts of the law, you
Yeah.
know,
And
cross-examining.
did you do
thinking.
debating at school?
Yes, I did. I did.
Yeah.
We're in we had a literary and debating society at Presbyterian Academy. I was the secretary of that for a year.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed that. We used to have inter-school debates, which I helped to organise, and away we all went on the bus. And you had the inter-school debate, and then we had a disco afterwards.
Yeah.
I remember doing one at Ayr Academy, in particular, where I think the subject was that it was to do with the power of advertising, that sometimes advertising can actually have the opposite effect to that which is intended. You know, how some adverts just would actually put you off.
Yeah.
And I remembered I was speaking for was I speaking for the motion or the amendment? I can't remember, but we got 8 votes. I remember turning up, that's 120 to 8. I remember turning up, I was the first speaker, and the girl from Ayr Academy, you had a pupil from each school in the team of 2. The girl from Ayr Academy, she disagreed with me, I disagreed with her, and we both disagreed with the other side. So it was all a wee bit of a fiasco. And there was a famous advert at the time, I think, for was it Nor Super something? And the punchline was, you can know something. They made a play on this alliteration of the K. So to make the point, I remember saying in my speech that sometimes the advert can have the opposite effect. And I said, you can know what I can mean, thinking that was being terribly clever. And I had my 3 pals in the front row of the debate, and they were warned, that's my joke, so make sure you laugh. So I'm in this cavernous assembly hall in Ayr Academy, made my joke, and my 3 pals fell about laughing, and nobody else reacted. So all in all, it was a bit of a disaster, but it was still enjoyable. It was a really good disco. So
yeah, I think the school debates were a great training ground.
oh yes,
I mean, obviously, my school career was many years before yours, but I remember representing coming to academy at some of these debates and
yeah.
against Ayr and such like that. My lasting memory is of one of the guys from our school who shocked the teachers, or he had them nearly shocked, because he ended. I don't even remember the subject of his debate, but I remember he ended his debate by summing up with the words, "What this country needs is constitution, institution, and prosperity." So I remembered it for, well, that must be
Yes.
about 60 years now. So
Oh, no, they were, when I look back as well too, they were a great, because it wasn't just the debating aspects, it was the social aspects, and
yeah,
you know, learning to organise things with the buses, and you know, what's the subject going to be. But no, I did enjoy them. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, and it was good fun meeting people from other schools as well. I
Yeah.
quite enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So good. And then university. You said that you found it quite hard.
I did. Well, as I said, I just found the topic. I worked hard to get there and had to keep working hard to get through the exams and everything. But I did, and came out the other end. And then you have to do I think you still do. You did a year postgrad with a diploma in legal practice, which was very useful, very sensible, because up until then the law was something quite dry and dusty in books. But when you actually were putting it into practice, and they had solicitors who would come in, a lot of classes in the evening, but actual practicing solicitors would come in and take us through real legal problems and how would you apply the law. So that was good, because you then started a traineeship with a bit more of an idea than I think you maybe did in the days when you just did the degree and then you moved on.
Yeah.
But I loved going to the court to watch trials and cases. And we did what was the class we did? I can't remember what it was called, but it was a 3-hour one. But we had an advocate was our tutor, and she used to take us over to the Court of Session to watch things that she thought we might find particularly interesting. And I kept that going actually when I came home, because my mother at that time worked in the Procurator Fiscal's office in Kilmarnock, and got permission from the fiscal there for me to go up and sit in the court to watch the trials, actually in the public benches. Anybody could go, but he took it a wee bit further and allowed me to use the Sheriff Court Library if I was working. And I remember sitting in the library, some of you means, and some of your viewers, is that the right word, from Burnsy stuff will remember the infamous Sheriff D.B. Smith from Kilmarnock, who I think was quite a Burns enthusiast. I know he was a curling expert, but I think he was quite a Burns enthusiast too. But I remember sitting in the library in the Sheriff Court one morning, engrossed in something, and I was aware the door had opened, and the room had gone a wee bit dark. And this was because the huge frame of Sheriff D.B. Smith in wig and gown was filling the door frame. And I kind of looked up, and there he is looming over me, and demanded to know what was I doing in his library. And I said, oh, I'm my name, and I'm a student, and the fiscal kindly lets me use the library. And I remember he boomed out, the Procurator Fiscal has no jurisdiction in my library. And I remember even in my embarrassment thinking, only a sheriff would have said it like that, you know. However, once he had established the terrifying creature that he was, he then took the wig off, sat down, asked me what I was doing, and sat working with me for about half an hour.
Oh, fantastic.
On whatever problems. It was marvellous. And the circle was kind of completed a few years later when I was working for North Ayrshire Council in Irvine in the court department. We did our court stuff in Kilmarnock Sheriff Court, and he was on the bench still when I was appearing in front of him. And I often thought I'd like to remind him of that wee terrified lassie that he came across in the sheriff's library, but I don't think he would have remembered me. Might not have helped me anyway.
I remember him. I didn't hear him speaking many times, but I remember him telling many a good story about various court cases, and
Yeah.
often wondered whether that would be allowed today.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, but no, I've fond memories of him. He's quite a controversial sheriff as well, I think.
Yeah.
But quite scary to appear in front of. But he was fine as long as you knew your stuff. You were fine. If you'd prepared, you know, you're all right.
Mm-hmm. And after university, you mentioned North Ayrshire Council. So what kind of law were you practicing?
Well, after I was still in Edinburgh when I qualified, and I did general practice for a while, and then I began to specialise in family law, adoption and divorce, and custody or access, custody and access cases. I found I really liked that. I really enjoyed that. I seemed to get on well with it. I always thought it was 75% law, 25% social work, really. Sometimes you would have clients coming in for the first 15 minutes, they would just cry because, you know, they were dealing with horrific breakups. Very often breakups were unexpected. And also I felt quite strongly that courtrooms weren't the places to sort these things out. The adversarial nature of our court system, where you get the two people into the room and you argue with each other, and then you get somebody to argue on your behalf, wasn't really the way I felt to sort out family matters where emotions ran high. And at Christmas time, you had the gamut of extra requests through the court for extra time at Christmas. And all this was played out in court together with other actions, perhaps involving motor insurance claims and that kind of thing. And eventually they changed to a system where you had a consistorial court where they only dealt with family matters. And I believe now they've gone even further and they have separate sheriff courts just to deal with these kind of matters, even at Christmas time. But there was at that point a family law association. This would be about 1986, 87. There was a family law association being set up with solicitors and sheriffs of a like mind, that this adversarial nature is not the way to sort these things out. And they encouraged mediation, and were looking at giving sheriff the powers to refer people for mediation. You couldn't make anybody go and have mediation and discuss things. If people insisted on going through a court thing, they would. But it certainly made a big difference, and my heart used to soar when I realised that I had the sheriff in my case that day was one of the sheriffs that was of that ilk. Yeah. Whereas there were the other sheriffs that used to come onto the bench, and my heart would sink because I knew we were just in for a fight, if you know what I mean. Similarly with other agents, some agents, solicitors would have the same view. Let's try and sort this out. They regarded it as a bit of a failure on your part if it got the length of a court hearing, you know, the final proof where all the final orders were made. Yeah. In the same way that my heart sank with some agents because they wouldn't try and sort it out. They would just want to, let's get on with this, you know. Yeah. But you were aware you had somebody's happiness and really the family relationships, that how they would go on for the rest of their lives. Not so much in your hands, because I wasn't making decisions. Sheriffs made the decisions. But there was a great deal of responsibility, I always thought, to present a case fairly and with as much information as I thought should be got out. Yeah, yeah. It sounds like it's been quite a challenging area to work in. It was, but it was very rewarding. I had some, you know, I had a lot of clients who recommended me to other people, and that was always very pleasing. You felt as if you'd done something right when that happened. But you also had to be quite firm with people sometimes, and make sure they heard the things that they would hear from the sheriff that they maybe didn't want to hear from me before we went into court. Even just the basic things of explaining to somebody what was going to happen. A lot of solicitors, I felt, didn't do that. Just take their clients into court and go on with it. The courts are terrifying places. When you don't know what's going to happen or who everybody is, and then all these people appear in gowns and wigs and sit in different places, and I always took the time to explain what was going to happen. And sometimes you'd have the family in the public benches there to see the dirty linen getting washed. However, but no, it was challenging but rewarding.
And when you moved on from that, what did you do next?
Well, we then went to live in France with my husband to do with my husband's work. So I didn't work at all over there. But when I came back, we ended up living in Ayr, and I began working on a part-time basis with North Ayrshire Council in the legal department when I was kind of back to doing bits and pieces of everything, mostly court-related. So Friday morning, Kilmarnock Sheriff Court was the court where the rent arrears were dealt with and the evictions, and but also some child protection stuff, families where there are issues and children needing taken into care or whatever. The council would often be in the place of parents, and there was a lot of work to do with that. And I had a spell working with the children's hearing system too, which was very challenging because some real awful situations some youngsters were in, and grandparents stepping in. Drugs were a big problem, and grandparents would step in where parents had become addicts, because otherwise the family would be split up. The child abuse cases were the hardest ones to deal with. They were really horrific,
harrowing,
horrendous, absolutely harrowing.
And your legal experience probably, or at least your experience of standing up in court, probably stood you in good stead for the highlight talks that you've done at the museum. Can you tell us about them?
Yes, well, it's my problem very often with these things that I think because of my legal training, I'm quite thorough in preparation, and I find it difficult to know what to miss out. So I always find it difficult to rein myself into the allotted time. But I did one. I've done one on Jean Armour. Jean Armour's life following her widowhood, because she had a long time. I think she had longer without Burns than she did with him, if I remember correctly. And I did one on someone that I think is a much maligned character in the Burns story, and that would be Gilbert Burns. And when I was a volunteer in the museum, I only stopped a couple of months or so ago, but this was way back, maybe 2018, before COVID. I had gone along to the Burns supper in the cottage, the very first one, I think, in 2016. Realised there was a lot of wonderful Burns stuff going on along there, and went back to find out how I could become involved, and guiding seemed to be the one. So I was guiding in the cottage and in the museum. I got the training, we did that, but I was able, through the curator, allowed me into what I call the inner sanctum in the museum upstairs, where there's many more things stored. And there are letters there between Gilbert Burns and Jean Armour following Burns' death. And when I was doing a wee bit of research, I use the term very loosely, I don't do research, I just read books, into Gilbert Burns, I got these letters out, and they were absolutely fascinating. The letter from Gilbert to Jean is there, and his reputation as being a bit of a fusspot and crossing the T's and dotting all the I's, I think, would certainly be merited. Most of the letters seem to start off with some kind of rebuke from him to Jean that he thought he might have heard from her a bit earlier than that. This would be around 1820, 1818, 1820, he was writing the letters. Because I was making some notes, and I wrote a date at the top of the page, 22nd January 1818, and thought, no, that can't be right. That's today's date. And I realised actually I was reading the letter exactly 200 years to the date it had been written by Gilbert, because it was 1818, and so it's quite something. But chatty letters that most of us would write to family members about what families were doing. Gilbert was very proud of his children, particularly proud of the son that became a minister, that ended up in New Zealand. Was it Thomas, I think? Would that be right? But in among the general chit chat about what families were doing, and he's asking Jean about her family, her and Burns' family, there was a discussion in one of the letters about this man that wanted to do a monument to Burns in Edinburgh and where it was going to go. And it was the weirdest thing in this general chit chat. Oh, and by the way, we've got this chap doing a monument, the one that's now in, I think it's now in the portrait gallery in
Yeah.
Edinburgh. But one of the letters was very poignant. It was the one, and included this in the wee highlight talk I did, but Gilbert writes to Jean from his home then in East Lothian. And part of the letter is to tell her that his mother has died, the bard's mother has died. And he writes out in this letter, but he is writing to Jean in Dumfries and saying, I just thought I would let you know that it might be an idea to put this in the local paper, because I think there are enough people still in Dumfries who might be interested to know that Agnes has gone. And he has written on the back of the letter the wording for an announcement in the paper. And he asks her to take it into, is it John McDermott, I think his name was, of the Dumfries and something Courier. But he says if you could tear this off and take it into him, and he'll print this wording in the paper. And the bottom half of the letter has a corner very neatly folded and torn out. And that was really quite something, to think that Jean had actually torn it out and taken it in to put in the paper. Again, it's just one of those things that brings the whole Burns story very much to life, because these were real people with real lives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I found it quite fascinating. I read Peter Westwood's book on Jean Armour some years ago.
Yeah.
And at that time, it hadn't occurred to me that there were people in Burns's family that had lives of their own that were sufficiently interesting to write a book. You know, and I've now come to appreciate that an awful lot more.
Yes.
I mean, Jean herself was a really strong woman. And I don't know if you want to say a few words about her.
I think with Jean, it's the way that we blithely about any situation. You utter a couple of sentences. For example, Jean's had twins, then she has another set of twins, and Burns is away back to Edinburgh, and then he comes back. But you say this quickly, but it doesn't begin to tell the kind of anguish that woman must have gone through. I mean, she's there with twins, even just delivering twins in those times. And when, you know, the famous quote, Robert should have had 12 wives, when Robert asked if they could bring up his daughter Diana Park. In some ways, I think that was a wonderful gesture on her part, but I think a lot of it she had to just get on with, because she couldn't leave. She couldn't pack the kids into the Volvo and go back to her mother's or get a council flat and do her own thing. But that doesn't take away from the fact that she was quite a special woman. And I think maybe there was an understanding in her that her man, he was the man for her, and there was an understanding in her that he was a wee bit different and a wee bit special. And actually, I'm quite lucky that I'm the one he's chosen to keep coming back to, you know?
Yeah.
And she has the inspiration for some absolutely beautiful poetry. And there is something in that love poetry, a little extra je ne sais quoi, in that wonderful love poetry when your name's Jean, when you hear it sung or recited at Burns suppers and things.
Yeah, fantastic. And you mentioned James Barke. What was your view of the James Barke novels?
Oh, I think they're wonderful. They're a wee bit flowery in bits. I looked into Barke's life quite closely. And I think the books are perhaps a little flowery. I remember reading an article in the paper, looked back some old cuttings, but one chap had done a crit of them in the Glasgow Herald, but he talks about I think what he's trying to say, there's an awful lot of sex in these books, but the word that he used was yielding. And he says that Jean and Robert yielded again and said, yes, there was rather a lot of yielding with other women too. I think James Barke might have been a wee bit obsessed. And I'm not sure, I don't know, I'd have to speak to experts or do a bit more reading, but I wonder if there might have been a desire within him, or an unwillingness to hear any criticism made of his hero.
Yeah.
He defends Burns, the infamous horse litter letter episode where Burns writes to Ainsley. Barke defends this, that on the basis, if I've understood his correspondence correctly, that the incident couldn't possibly have taken place because Jean was hugely pregnant and he had a gammy knee, having fallen from the carriage in Edinburgh, and one or two other reasons they thought it couldn't have possibly have happened. And I found most of Barke's stuff I liked his letters, but there was one or two things I just found a wee bit difficult to believe, that maybe you just have to admit that this man wasn't perfect, you know, and take it from there. But I absolutely love the books. I've reread them 2 or 3 times. I remember reading them in my late teens and being given a couple of them for my 21st birthday, because if I have books that I like to keep the book and own it and reread it. Years later, when I came to read them again, I went to borrow them from Carnegie Library, and they had to be brought up from the bowels of the library because they're no longer displayed on the shelves. There's hundreds of second-hand copies available, but I borrowed them from Carnegie Library, and the librarian who brought them to me when I went in to pick them up was quite excited that somebody was ordering them, because she remembered James Bark, who was a friend of her father's, and she remembered him coming to their house when she was a wee girl. So that was quite a nice wee turn on it. But
It makes it a lot more personal.
yes, absolutely. But
Yeah.
the research that the man has done for the books, and I've looked through the Bark papers in the Mitchell Library. I've spent many happy hours there, going through his collection, which were donated to the library on his death. And he was also very fond of, the name has completely escaped me, another author. He's got a whole couple of scrapbooks about cuttings about that. He was also a very gifted piper and a piping tutor. And the man had many strings to his bow, but the correspondence is fascinating. There's correspondence between him and other Burns experts, about letters and things, and trying to get dates for things. When he was writing the books, he was trying to pinpoint the date when something would happen. And there are, at the beginning of the books, as you'll know if you've read them, but there are lists of the characters, but I think there's a very, very small percentage of characters that were not real people. And I think they were in to help with the sort of narrative of the story, but tiny details about the characters. And there was two or three of them that I just took away to check, just to see, and that he was right enough, tiny details, and he was correct. Foibles that the characters had.
Yeah.
And in among his papers was a photograph of him at the grave of Daddy Auld in Malcolm Kirkyard, alongside an envelope with scraps of stone from the gravestone, which was quite macabre. But I think he maybe have been an admirer of Daddy Auld. Certainly the way he presents Burns and Daddy Auld's relationship in his books is one of mutual admiration and a recognition within one of the other of the talents. Daddy Auld is realising very early on, when a lot of his elders are getting their pants in a fankle, as my mum would say, about this man Burns and this stuff. Daddy Auld has actually taken a step back and thinking, this is dangerous. We need to keep an eye on this. What he was saying and all the rest of it. And he writes about Daddy Auld's thoughts, and I always got the feeling that in a different time or a different place, they might have been quite good friends.
And that's interesting. So pity Jim wasn't able to join us, because he's done a lot of work on that area, Holy Molly's Prayer and such like, and the connections with Mauchline Kirk and all that kind of stuff. So we could maybe get an opportunity for you to talk to him about that at some point.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah. I think some of the Bark's description of some of the characters, I mean, the way he describes Willie Fisher, you can just about smell him coming out the pages. I've read them several times, and I think a bit like watching a film or reading a story. Once you've read it and you've got the plot and you understand how they get from the beginning to end, you can kind of relax a wee bit and pay attention to the surroundings, the descriptions. So I've gone through the Bark books again and done that. And I think they're just a very good way of being introduced to the Burns story in a fairly accessible fashion. I know that Sean McGlashan, who was sorry Douglas, Sean McGlashan at the museum, when he became the new curator, didn't know very much about Burns, although he very qualified as a curator in the art side of things and whatnot. I think I'm right in saying it was Hugh Farrell suggested to him that he read Burns' letters and the James Bark books as his way of getting to know.
That's fascinating.
I would agree.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, I think they're easy to read, and much easier than going straight in and reading the poems or reading the letters. I would have said, yeah.
And you don't need a glossary.
Yeah. You also, I think I read somewhere where you'd done a talk on Burns Lasses. Was that at the Irvine Lasses?
Gosh, I did a Zoom thing for them during lockdown on on my favourite things in the museum. The way we do the guiding in the museum, you choose the museums in sections. It's not chronological, but you choose 3 of your favourite items from each section, which gives you 9 items. And one of the cabinets round the outside, which deal with 8 of Burns's major works or significant works. And my friend Rosemary Murdoch, my very good friend Rosemary at the Lassies, asked if I might consider doing a wee Zoom thing as if I was doing a tour in the museum. So I got some photographs, obviously, and did that. So that might have been where that came
right,
from.
okay. Maybe I picked it up wrong. That's,
Yeah.
So being
I did a thing about the Lassies quite recently for the Parkinson's support group in North Yorkshire.
maybe that's where I saw.
That was very recent. I did that with Helen Matthews, the current president of the Lassies.
Yeah. Very good.
Ian MacPhail had been in speaking about Burns, and they'd asked him if that it might be quite nice to get somebody to present the Lassies' point of view on the Burns story. But Helen and I were a little concerned that if you wanted it from the Lassies' point of view, that they were going to be expecting some sort of Jackie Collins style expose on the yielding life, to use James Bark's word. But we just spoke about all the women in Burns' life. And actually, when you really look at it, if you go from the beginning with his mother and his sisters right through to Jessie Lure right at the end, there are a lot of them from a lot of different areas and whatnot.
Yeah. I remember picking up a book. I think the title was Burns Lasses, and it was basically the lasses in his life, and it was either a bit of a story about them, or it was the song or the poem that related to them.
Yeah.
And initially, I was quite fascinated at how many pages there were.
Yes. Yeah. There's I wonder, just as an aside, talking about the lasses, and when you mentioned Jean Armour, I love Catherine Cherkasska's book, The Jewel, which I always thought was a wee bit of a kind of James Bark style book, as a kind of novel based on fact, but written from Jean's point of view.
Yeah, I've not read that.
Well, I would definitely recommend that you read that. That was
making a wee notes.
Yeah.
So your experience as a guide, you must have met quite a lot of fascinating people.
Yes, I did. Absolutely. From a professor from Sydney, who was a Scottish, name has gone completely out of my head, Scottish writer, lived at Abbotsford, Walter Scott. How could I forget Walter Scott? She was a Walter Scott expert, and she was over in Scotland to attend some symposium in Edinburgh, but she had a free day and thought she would come down and find out a wee bit more about Burns. And she was the last tour of the day in the cottage, and we were there until they came to put the shutters up and lock the door. And I think if they hadn't had to lock the cottage up, we would still have been there. I think I learned as much from her as she hopefully learned from me about Burns. So you had very academic visitors. We would have people doing studies, wanting particular information. I loved January time, particularly because you got a lot of school children who had projects to do. And they would come with their parents, all enthusiastic. The really enthusiastic, conscientious ones would be there with their parents. And I can still remember one wee girl, and I would love to have read her project. She was about 11, and she was so intense and she was so keen. And she explained to me what she had to do for this project. So I said, right, you and I are going to go around this cottage and around this small holding, and I'm going to tell you things nobody else in your class are going to know. And I remember she went out the other end through in the byre and through the rooms and out through the kitchen. And I went through with her. Then I had to go back to the byre to start the next tour. And when I came out after that next tour, she was sitting at the education pavilion on the bench, scribbling furiously in her notebook. So I like to think that maybe she's maybe still interested in Burns as she goes on through. As I mentioned earlier on, visitors from very far afield who would come into the cottage and become very emotional because they couldn't believe they were actually there. And quite a few people, local people who were there because they had relations or friends visiting from other parts of the country who wanted to go, and they had never been to Burns Cottage, and they were getting dragged along by the visitors, even though they'd lived near it for a number of years. And every now and then you would get someone. I always asked people what had brought them there and what they knew about Burns, and because you don't want to, if they know quite a bit, or you certainly don't want to be guiding somebody about that is going to be able to tell you things. Like the PhD student I had one Sunday morning, I remember, But I would say, you know, what brings you here? And a couple of times the men there who really don't want to be visiting with their relations would say, well, he populated the southwest of Scotland single-handed. He was never out the pub and he died drunk in a ditch in Dumfries, you know. But I always took that as a bit of a challenge. And I said, okay, then. I said, well, let's do a wee tour and have a chat and see what else we can do. And I remember one man at the end of it who'd started off in a very disillusioned state of mind, shook my hand and said that he had no idea there was so much to Burns and could I recommend a book? So I figured that was a triumph, that one.
That was a tick.
That was a tick. But very often you end up, the best tours were the ones where we just ended up having a bit of a chat. Or if the museum was quiet, I would always ask people what their particular interest was, because that could focus down your attention, you know, on the exhibits that you would show them.
It was very much in my later years that I began to realise the importance of a guide at a museum.
Right.
I would always join a guided tour or something like that.
Yes, yes, I'm exactly the same.
Because the facts that you can gain from that, as opposed to wandering around yourself and reading the labels, are just amazing.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think guides are very much underrated when it comes to tourism. I think tour guides especially should encourage people to use a guide at the place of
Yes,
interest.
indeed,
Yeah.
indeed, yeah. I think particularly in the cottage, I mean,
Yeah.
there are information sheets given in the cottage, but I think I mean, the cottage is just kind of small and damp and chilly, and it's not damp now. It's all been, you know, it's been treated a lot. But I have had a couple of dreich November Sunday afternoons with my flask of tea sitting on a bale of ale in the byre, hoping somebody would come in the barn, I should say. But and usually somebody would come crunching up the path as soon as I had unscrewed the top of my flask and got settled down, put it all away again. But I always tried to make people, to tell them what would happen in a particular room in the cottage. But when you got into the kitchen, I would just ask them to take a moment, use your imagination. Who is here? What are they doing? Where's everybody sleeping? What are the noises? There's a wee soundtrack of chickens and things in the kitchen. But we'd look at the box bed, and I would wonder if the tutor's there. How many bodies have you got, and where are they sleeping? And one wee boy, or not just one, several children would ask me questions. But I remember one wee boy asking where Burns plugged in his iPad. And just as he's getting over that shock, he realised he couldn't find a toilet or a shower, and then when you talk about the midden, the chamber pot getting emptied out the window onto the midden, just absolutely horrified, you know. Although they liked the idea of not having to go to school, but then that was counteracted by, oh well, if maybe didn't have to go to school, but we still had to see a tutor, and then he stayed with you 2 or 3 nights in the week, you know. Maybe it's better just to go to school and the tutor wasn't at home. But there's so much of this that indicates what Burns was going to become, I think, in the cottage. And then talking about Tam O'Shanter, and although obviously Burns was very far away from there by the time he wrote it, the fact that he remembered the old brig and the stories about the witches on the flying brooms and whatnot, and the bullock that had got trapped in the ruined kirk and was bellowing to get out. And of course, the very superstitious 18th century villagers thinking the devil's come back to Alloway, and it's this bullock screaming because it can't get out. And then the guy providing the music for the dancers for the witches is a bullock, the devil in the shape of a bullock. All fascinating. And then I found people are always interested too I could always tell as a tour is going on, you can always tell when you have somebody's attention. And when I finished the tour in that last section, we were quite near the cabinet about Tam O'Shanter, but people were always very interested in that because it gives you the story of how Tam O'Shanter came to be written, and it was written as a ghost story to go with an etching of the old ruined church, which Burns wanted in Gross's Book of Antiquities of Scotland, because that's where his father was buried, and he's still, it warms me to think of Burns harking back to those memories. And it's such a contrast to what must have been a very sad day when they brought his father back, effectively a broken man, on his death, to be buried there.
Yeah.
So Burns is a gift that keeps on giving. You know, the more you go in to find the answer to one question and come away maybe with an answer, but with at least 6 more questions that you need the answer to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think more and more we need to find opportunities for especially young people to learn about Burns. I mean, I've got to admit that when I was at school, Burns was the furthest thing from my thoughts. I mean, I was brought up in the Lake District and arrived in Cumnock as a 7-year-old in the middle of the Burns season. And not only could I not understand Burns, I couldn't understand the other kids in the playground. So it took me a long time. But I think it's more about the life that he had and the things that he did and what was going on round about him in the world that I find quite fascinating.
Yeah, I think context is very important.
Yeah.
I think context is very important with most things in life, but there's so much more to an understanding of Burns if you actually put him where he was when he
Yeah.
wrote things and when he thought things, and also the level that he was in. My very favourite Burns poem, I think, is the address to the Unco Guid, the rigidly righteous.
Yeah.
I mean, there are many of them I like. There are many verses I love, but that's one I keep going back to. And I wonder if that's got to do with my days when I was doing a lot of legal aid work and I was speaking up for the poor folk that didn't quite get things right in their lives and trying to help them sort themselves out a wee bit. Because in that poem, as Burns actually says to the rigidly righteous, right, you lot, hear me, I'm going to tell you about these people and I'm going to make you look at yourself, your position and their position and compare them and actually make you realise there's not that much difference between you when you take away your privilege and your money and your, what's that wonderful line? What's that more than all the lave your better art or hiding? I think that's such a clever line. And pointing out that when you've got money and the wind and the tide is fair in your face and you're scudding on there, fine. But if you live your life in the teeth of the wind and the sea, things are a bit different. I think it's a wee bit like if you're going to understand somebody really, you need to walk a mile in their shoes. That would be a kind of modern day interpretation, perhaps, of it. But I don't know quite how we got onto that, but.
Well, I'm glad that we did because one of the questions we always ask is do you have a favourite poem? And secondly, is there a poem that you'd like to give us a couple of verses from?
Oh gosh, no. My favourite one I would say would be the address to the Unco Guid because I think it's just very clever. But my other favourite one that I love, which isn't done nearly often enough for me, is Death in Dr. Hornbook.
All right.
I think it is entertaining, it's funny, it's clever, it displays the knowledge of what medical understanding and treatments and things were at that time in Scotland. And it is funny maybe for a reason, again, this idea of context, that there's a line in it, well, the story that everybody knows that supposedly Burns as the narrator is coming home after a few jars and he comes round the hill there and he sees a figure. And this is Death with his trident and his scythe and his hood, and he's sitting not looking very happy at the side of the road, which makes me laugh for a start because how else could you expect Death to look? But Death has got the time to be sitting at the side of the road pondering on his situation because his trade is being taken away by this upstart, John Wilson, who Burns has heard boasting about he fancies himself as a bit of an amateur medic, but his wee pills and potions are actually killing more people than they're actually saving. And there's a line in it, I think, where he says, what I mean about Burns being so clever and context being everything, where he addresses Death, but he says something about freeing hae ye been mown when other folk are busy sowing. And when you understand the poem was written, I think about the spring of 1985, at which point most of Burns' contemporaries would be trying to get their spring crops into the ground. And there's Death going around taking in his crop and everybody else is trying to get theirs sown. And there's a thing in it too about Death saying how he's got to make his bread in some way. And this idea of Death having to make a living, it's the juxtaposition of life and death is funny. And then he goes on and he moans about what he's doing and the very clever verses of the ways in which the people are being killed, the problems they've got, the girl that's become pregnant, got herself into bother, a young squire that's desperate to inherit and become the squire himself. So he manages to to find a way to get rid of his old dad through John Wilson, who's supposedly trying to cure him. And then the wonderful bit towards the end where Death says, but I've found the answer. I know how I'm going to get this guy back. And I don't know about anybody else, but I had a moment where I thought, yes, here we are. We're going to get the answer to life, death, and the universe here, you know. But of course, the old Kirk Hammer strikes the bell. That wee, what is it? That wee short Urayont the twal that raised his baith. I took the road that pleased myself and said it death. And that in itself, I think, is very philosophical. That Death got up and went his way, and so did Burns. And then isn't that just life?
And it's a great way to wind up a poem. Just that final line, tremendous.
But I love hearing it recited, and as I say, I don't think it's done often enough.
I think the first time I heard it was Bob Shankland at New Cumnock, and Bob is long gone. His son Robert is still a member of our club, for former president, but he did it, and I hung on every word. I mean, I was fairly new to the Burns world when I heard it, but it's a lasting memory of him reciting that poem. So we talked about poems. What about songs? Any favourite songs?
Oh heavens! I love Duncan Gray. There's something about that, and the mention of Ailsa Craig. I think is that maybe the only time Burns mentioned Ailsa Craig or the sea, which is odd. Living so close to the sea for so long. I love Mary Morrison. I just adore Mary Morrison, sung by, this is showing my age, Kenneth McKellar. I just love his version of it. And I love that line, you are na Mary Morrison, after he's described all these lovely things, but this was fair and that was braw. And you on the toast o' the two nice side and said, among them all, you are na Mary Morrison. So Mary Morrison must have been quite something if these people or these visions weren't as beautiful as she was. I'm sure I saw a television programme or heard something on the radio, but Hugh McDermott, Christopher Greaves, the great poet Hugh McDermott, said that was his favourite line in poetry because of that, because you are na Mary Morrison and just what it conjures up. It's this idea of describing something by reference to what it's not.
Yeah.
So you have to use your imagination. But no, that would be my favourite one. And Ebanks and Braes. I love Ebanks and Braes.
That's the one that I got my Burns certificate from when I was in primary school. And I'll name drop as well. My teacher at the time was Moira Anderson.
Oh, well, you've mentioned Moira Anderson. I've mentioned Kenneth McKellar. That's quite good. Two names to drop there.
Yeah, but they both go back a long, long way.
Yeah, there's just something about Kenneth McKellar's voice in that song. It's just beautiful.
Yeah. So career in Burns is he's still continuing to be a member of Irvine Lassies?
Yes, I'm still a member, and I'm now a member of Irvine Burns Club. I was given a gift of that when I came off the committee at the Lassies earlier in the year. So I'm delighted about that. I love Wellwood. I think it's quite a special place. I love the atmosphere. Yeah, and the last couple of years I've been involved in the schools guiding programme, which the education convener Derek Murdoch organises, puts a power of work into it. But I really do enjoy that. The kids get a mixture of PowerPoint presentation upstairs in the music room, and then they come down into the Burns room with the murals, and they learn about the flax dressing and they learn about Burns life in Edinburgh. But my favourite bit of the tour is when you have them round the table in the director's room, and they learn about the editions, the first edition, the Edinburgh edition, and the Kilmarnock edition are brought through on the original manuscripts, and talk to the children. They're usually about 9 or 10 years of age, but we talk to them about the books and then show them the manuscripts, and then I get them to marry up, or the guides, we get them to marry up the written word in the manuscripts with the printed word on the page. And we talk about why maybe Burns wrote on both sides of the paper, and what did he use, how did he get ink, and insurance, explaining that the books are kept in a safe and temperature is very important, and talking about how the poems came to be written, talk about subscription. Obviously subscription means something a wee bit different to them nowadays with YouTube and whatnot, but it's wonderful to see them, ask them lots of questions and see them trying to work out what it was all about. And some of them spot in the the frieze above the picture rail in the director's room are the names of all the past presidents. And some of them take great delight in sporting the name of their grandpa or something like that. Although I had one, I really do enjoy doing that, but I had my slightly brought back down to earth one time as I was going out the director's room thinking, went quite well. I had their attention. That was okay. That was okay. And one wee girl said to me, "I really like that, Mrs. Swinley. Did you know Robert Burns?" I said, "Oh dear, no, not quite that old. I would like to have known him, but not quite that old. But just if there's just some way that you could bottle that enthusiasm and get them to keep it going as they get older."
Mind you, you mentioned Wellwood, and Wellwood is responsible for my interest in Burns, believe it or not. I mean, I told the story in my own podcast, but I was basically persuaded to go along with some members of the New Covenant Burns Club to Wellwood. I had no interest in Burns. I was just going along for the ride kind of thing, and I got hooked. And the thing that I got hooked with was two things. One was sitting around the director's table and talking about the invitations to be I've lost my train of thought. Invitations to be
an honorary member,
honorary member of the club, and all the letters and all the people that had written these letters. But the big thing was that once we'd done all the stuff, all the museum and seen the original manuscripts and such like, we sat and somebody found some dregs in the bottom of a few bottles of whiskey, and we had a dram each, and people were talking about Burns as though he was there, and I get totally hooked. I just thought it was fantastic, and I've loved Wellwood ever since. I don't get going down often enough, but I think it's fantastic.
No, it's a lovely place, and as you know, the Irvine Lassies, it's their kind of clubhouse, if you like, as well. We are able to use it through the Irvine Burns Club. But I remember at I think it might have been St Andrews Night a couple of years ago, Ian MacPhail was the president of Irvine Burns Club at the time, but there's mention made and maybe a token of our thanks for being able to use the club made, and Ian very graciously accepted that on behalf of the Burns Club. But he said that the Lassie's use of the club added to its lustre and took nothing away. And I remember writing that down verbatim, and it's printed in the Secretary's report for that year so that it's in the record of the Lassies, because I thought it was a lovely thing to say, you know. Of course, Ian MacPhail is so articulate and has a lovely turn of phrase. It was just a lovely thing to have said.
Tremendous. Well, we're kind of running out of time, so is there anything that we've missed? Anything else we want to talk about?
I don't think so. I think you're maybe we're talking about our Burns heroes. I think maybe I've covered that already with my reference to Gilbert. I think there are many heroes in the Burns story who contributed in their own way to where he ended up. But one I think maybe that is perhaps maybe the biggest, I don't know, but William Burns or Burness as he would have been, I think, hadn't been the way he was, would we ever have heard of Robert Burns?
That's interesting.
Primary school closes down and William decides, well, they're not going to get their education at school, but he goes out with some of the other smallholders, and between them they contribute to the fee and the upkeep of John Woodruff, the tutor. I mean, obviously there had to be an element of a spark of intelligence, creativity and imagination there in the first place. But if William Burns hadn't made sure there was pennies available to get the things like the lounger and whatnot into the cottage, the periodicals and books and Woodruff, would we ever have heard of Burns?
No, you're probably right. Yeah, that's an interesting question. And perhaps we don't hear enough about his life. I mean, you know, there's the outline of a story, you know, coming from the sort of Kincardine area and down via Edinburgh and such like. And I often think that there's not enough made of that.
Yes.
But I don't.
As I say, with a small, I mean, Burns had that intelligence anyway, but you still have to get something to ignite it.
Yeah.
Burns talks about his muse, you know, if nothing had ignited the muse, would we have ever have heard of him? Would he ever have been encouraged? And I think the William Burns story itself is quite a tragic one. I mean, he ended up coming out in that dreadful court action, successful, but not before he had been, I think, broken by it completely.
Yeah. And that happened in so many cases in these days,
Yeah.
debtors' prisons and such like, and John LePrake was an example of that, that
Right.
ended up in a debtor's prison for not doing anything wrong other than loaning money to somebody else.
Yeah. Trying to help somebody out.
Yeah, yeah, it was a terrible time, and I think there's loads of fascinating stories, and it's great that you're able to tell them, and you're able to research them enough and pass on that knowledge, especially to the young people that you're coming across. So fantastic. Hope you keep going with that. I know you're not doing much guiding at the moment, but
So as they were looking to be moving closer to Edinburgh, so I won't be able to do so much of that, but there might be a way. Hope I can still do bits and pieces.
yeah.
Yeah.
Or you could do some guiding in Edinburgh.
Yes, you never know. I can maybe start up my own Burns Tours company in Edinburgh.
Sounds like a great idea. So anyway, I just want to say thank you for telling us all about your life with Robert Burns. Thanks
Thank
very
you. I've
much.
enjoyed it. Thank you, Douglas.
Right, just.